Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Wave Running Podcast. Today we're here with Gaby, who is a nutritionist. She founded Intense Eat Fit, which is pretty cool. She studied at the University of Western Australia, but also has a degree from overseas in Mexico as well. But yeah, give us a little bit of a background before we dive into nutrition.
Sure. And thanks for inviting me. So yes, I am a dietitian and a sports nutritionist, and I predominantly work with triathletes and ultra distance runners. And I completed my dietetics degree in Mexico. That's where I'm from. So that was over a decade ago. And then from there, I did a diploma in sports nutrition with the International Olympic Committee. That was a couple of years doing that. I, at the same time, work with the State Institute of Sport, working with the kayaking, rowing, and sailing state teams. I was their dietitian. And I really, ever since I started in nutrition and even years before that, I knew I wanted to do a sports nutrition. Sport has always been a passion for me and something that I really enjoy. I've been a triathlete for over 15 years now, and I knew I wanted to be involved. So when I discovered sports nutrition, I absolutely fell in love. So when I went into my dietetics degree, I knew I wanted to specialize in sports nutrition, which, I achieved that through that degree and the sports nutrition diploma. However, on top of that, I also wanted to go overseas and learn elsewhere about exercise and health and other areas that, of course, complemented. So that's how I ended up coming to Western Australia, to the University of Western Australia. And I studied a master's degree in exercise and health. And life kept me here. So I moved here in 2016 and I've been living here since then. Of course, I've been visiting family and everything, but now Perth is a place I call home. And 2021, that's when I started my private practice here. And because I'm a triathlete and I enjoy endurance, very quickly, that was the area I focus on. And it seems like every year I keep going into longer and longer distance with my clients. So every year there's more emphasis towards the ultra endurance space, which I absolutely love. It's so fascinating and it's so engaging for me when we're looking at putting together a plan for someone who's going to be racing for 4 days or longer is something that, is quite exciting and definitely something I've been enjoying a lot in recent years.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's so cool. Like, you know Phil Gore as well, right? The backyard ultra record holder for Australia.
Yes. So I've been working with Phil Gore since 2022. And we've been essentially, I think I already lost count of how many backyard ultras we've worked on together on his nutrition plan. But one of those was his world record success with 102 hours. And of course, the 24-hour track that he's done as well, where he also established a new record. So yes, been working with him for quite some time. And definitely quite fascinating to work with someone who is such a high level and, of course, running for so long.
Yeah, I think it's so cool that you started really broad. Like you started with the kayaking and all these different sports, but because you did triathlon for a lot of years, your head is in that space. And I feel like the passion kind of helps a lot because you've niched down into what you love the most, which is like the endurance side of it. And not every nutritionist has that like endurance background. So it's nice to have a nutritionist that also knows what you're going through, what the sport is about and all that. So anyone that wants advice, definitely go hit up Gaby afterwards and hopefully she'll give us a few details that will help you as well through this podcast. And just to start off, I might play like a customer kind of perspective as well sometimes, and or a patient, let's call it, and you can ask me questions about myself as well. Because I don't think my nutrition is always perfect either, and I want to learn. So that'll be cool. And I think from my standpoint, as a person that wants to learn, I know that nutrition is something I want to focus on because one, I want to increase my performance, and also two, I want to make sure I don't have gut issues. So I think that's the main two factors that will revolve everything around. But maybe start off with the marathon's coming up, Sydney Marathon, and I want people to know a bit more about carb loading because I think there's a lot of different contradicting sources out there. So is it good to carb load really early, like a week out, or is it better to do it 1 to 2 days before? I think from what I understand, it seems like 1 to 2 days before is a bit better, but it might depend.
Yeah, definitely. So first off, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about the benefits benefits of carb loading, but I can say in short, definitely carb loading is something that is going to benefit someone's performance, especially when we're talking, in this case, a marathon. Of course, there are some instances in which carb loading is not as helpful, but we will talk about that. But to answer the question in terms of how far in advance should someone carb load? Yes, ideally 2 to 3 days, and it depends on how much the person is willing to consume during those days. So ideally, the recommendation is to aim for 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight per day. So for example, someone who is on the 8 grams per kilo per day may prefer to do over 3 days, so that way they make sure that they have enough carbohydrate consumption in the lead up to the race. Whereas someone who, let's say, is at the 12th and maybe 2 days is going to be sufficient. Now, doing it for longer than that is not as helpful, because the thing with carbohydrate loading is that the objective is that we want to get the glycogen stores full. And unfortunately, what you have, each of us have let's say, a fuel tank, and it's of a particular size. And once that is full, it's done. There's nowhere else you can store it. So once those stores are full, there's no more room to save it except for fat. In that case, it's like, okay, now we have this excess. The body will save it because it's energy. So it's like, okay, let's save this, but it's going to go into fat, which of course the body uses for energy. But in this case, the objective is we want to have that premium fuel top up. So that's why doing it longer than 3 days won't make a big difference.
Yeah. And I think there's other factors to consider as well. Like, for example, a lot of people will be running on race week as well, a little bit. And obviously that uses the glycogen storage. So if you're just carving up a lot with a week to go, but still running like a few times that week, then I guess it depletes that a little bit anyway. So I feel like it's more of a thing of eat kind of normally and then like closer to the race, like 2 to 3 days out, like you said, depending on what end of the range you're going for, 8 grams an hour to 12 grams an hour, you can tailor it in that way. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said glycogen or glucose is the premium fuel. Can you talk more about the difference between fat as a fuel versus glucose as a fuel?
Yeah, certainly. So our body uses both. We use carbohydrate and fat. And of course, carbohydrate breaking down into glucose, and eventually either glucose or fat is going to be converted into energy. And there are different ways in which that can occur. So in the case of carbohydrate, we get it through the glycogen, which is, let's say, the tank and the storage that you have in your body, or through blood glucose, which is the sugar circulating in your blood. Those are the two ways you get carbohydrate when you're exercising. In the case of fat, there is free fatty acids, which of course are those that are circulating in your blood. And you also get your fat reserves that are stored in your muscles to be used as energy. So the thing is that carbohydrate is a really efficient fuel. So when you need energy quick, carbohydrate is going to be the body's preferred option, because it's very efficient and very quick to convert into energy. So for someone who's wanting to push really high intensity, having enough carbohydrate available is going to be helpful to sustain that high intense effort. Most of the time, we're using both carbohydrate and fat as energy. But the difference is that the higher the intensity at which someone is trying to push, the more the ratio of carbohydrate is going to be utilized. So in the case of a carbohydrate loading, what we want to make sure is that there is enough in the tank by the time we show up to race day. And when we're talking about the blood glucose, well, that is why we have energy gels and sports drinks, or in the case of ultra, sandwiches, fruit. The objective of that food that we're consuming predominantly is going to supply the body with that blood glucose that helps us continue to sustain that high intensity effort. The lower the intensity of the effort, the more the ratio of fat is going to be. And it means that, for example, this is an example that I often talk about. So in the case of someone hitting the wall, by the way, is this something that has happened to you? Bonking or hitting the wall?
Actually, never in like a marathon, but I have hit the wall in like an 80K race before. Yeah. So the longer stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry about that, because obviously it's awful. So physiologically, what happens when someone hits the wall or is bonking? what is occurring is that the carbohydrate reserve and the availability of carbohydrate gets so restricted that you hit a wall and your body doesn't have an alternative but to slow down, because continuing to move at the rate and the intensity at which you were moving is no longer possible. Your body needs to slow down, because now fat is going to be the main energy, and that one takes way more time to be converted into energy. So if you want to keep moving, you need to go slower, otherwise it's going to be impossible to do what you want to do and get to that finish line.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I heard of it referred to as the crossover concept, I think. Like, the higher the intensity, the more glucose is favored, but obviously you still use a bit of fat. And then lower intensity, you use more fat as opposed to glucose. And then I think it's called the crossover concept because as you increase intensity, it kind of changes, right? And it's pretty
exactly.
similar in terms of same with the energy system. When you're running really hard, some of it is still aerobic, but it's like a combination of aerobic and anaerobic, but you tap in more to the anaerobic system as you go higher in the energy system. But yeah, I think everything you've said so far makes a lot of sense. So yeah, glucose premium fuel is what is the take-home message for all the listeners. Are there any misconceptions that you know of that a lot of runners make mistakes of when people are trying to carb load?
I can think of two. One is the one that I've seen the most recently is the assumption that because someone is eating energy gels or having a sports drink or constantly eating during the race, the carb loading is not going to be important because they are still having carbohydrate during the race. And it turns out that, of course, that energy or that nutrition is supplying carbohydrate, but it's not making up for the lack of glycogen. So someone who does the carb loading, shows up to the start line with the tank full, is going to perform better than someone who is relying on that constant intake of energy, especially when there are other complicating factors that could present, such as having gut issues or not having interest in food or nausea or something that stops the person from fueling. Having that tank and the fuel available there is going to be extremely helpful in the case of the athlete not being able to consume that energy. So that is from the perspective of, is this good or not? Definitely that's one big misconception I've been seeing a lot recently. And the second misconception is that a lot of people assume that carb loading is equal to having a big pasta patty the night before, and that is going to be enough. That as long as you have a massive bowl of pasta, that is going to be sufficient for you to have a successful carb loading. And as we already talked about, well, actually, you need at minimum, I would say, 1 day of carbohydrate loading where you're consuming those 8 to 12 grams per kilo. And ideally, I would say for most people, I do recommend both days to make sure that the carb loading was successful. So that is the other misconception I often see around it.
Yeah, for sure. I think I tried to work out my personal what that is, and I think the higher end, 12 grams per kg for me was 660 grams. But I saw other people, obviously, I'm on the lighter side. Some people have to eat 800 grams, 1,000 grams, or whatever, and that's a lot of food. We're talking about someone used bagels as a reference, but it was 13 bagels for 880 grams of carbs or something like that, which is a lot. So you can't have that in one meal, obviously. So that it's another reason why it's important to kind of spread it out across the day as well. You can't just have one huge pasta ball the night before. So yeah, that's a good point. And in regards to the other, is it called macronutrient? I'm not a nutrition, but there's carbs, fat, protein. But I'm also thinking about fiber too. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on fiber, because I feel like it might be better to avoid fiber when it's getting really close to the race. Is that true?
Absolutely. So those are the risks with carb loading are, let's say, the biggest one is someone loading on other things that could upset the stomach. So, of course, in the case of carbohydrate, many options are very high in fiber, especially if someone is concerned about I don't want to eat that much sugar because I hear it's not good for me. So they try to carb load on really high fiber foods. And now what they are doing is that, yes, there's a lot of carbohydrate, but now there's a lot of fiber. And that can absolutely cause gut issues because now the amount of fiber is beyond of what's recommended. That's one. The other one is the amount of fat. So, for example, I know you mentioned bagels, which by the way are fantastic, but a lot of people will think of carbohydrates as ice cream, pizza, donuts. And yes, they are high in carbs, those foods, but many of them, especially depending on how you are preparing them and how many layers of cheese you are using for that, can be really high in fat. And that also can be a problem because now you are loading on carbohydrate and fat. And of course, that is a significant increase to your energy and to your fat, which can cause issues on the day. So definitely important to be aware of reducing fiber intake. And the benefit of doing that in the case of fiber is that it means that you are leaning for options that are easier to fit in, let's say. So it's easier to, let's say, drink a glass of orange juice than eating probably 6 oranges to make up for that glass. So of course, that makes it easier to make up, like to meet the carbohydrate intake without loading on lots of volume of food as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think, yeah, carb density is quite important. And the best example I use, which I recommend people, is the Morton 320 drink mix. Like, it's like 80 grams of carbs with like 500 ml of water. Yes, it's pretty thick and some people might find it disgusting, but honestly, if you have that, it feels like it's a good leeway to build more carb storage. And yeah, I always feel more confident going into a longer race like a marathon or ultra marathon when I have that Morton 320 drink mix, because I know that it's literally free extra performance. I love to have like bananas on race morning, but what's your thought of that? Is that actually high in fiber or is that like good?
No, that's really good. Bananas are probably, as a dietitian working with endurance athletes, they are probably my favorite food, I'll say. So actually, favorite fruit. There's many foods, but
Yeah.
favorite fruit, bananas are amazing. And that is because they are high in carbs, they are low in fiber, they are easy to carry, they are easy to eat. Not everybody loves them. By the way, fun fact about Phil Gore, he hates bananas. Nothing
Oh,
wrong about bananas, he just doesn't like them. So that was very interesting. And of course, challenging when you want someone to eat more. And of course, bananas are out from the options. But yeah, bananas on race day, they are perfect. I would say, depending on the race and of course how serious you're taking it and how early in the morning you're eating more than a banana is going to be helpful. So, for example, if you were to have a bagel with a nice spread of your preference, I will probably suggest something like jam. And that banana, it's an amazing pre-race meal because the morning of the race, what you want to do is to finish topping up that fuel tank. Because even though you did your carb loading, the glycogen stored in your liver goes lower during night because your brain uses glucose as the main fuel. And even though you are sleeping, your brain still is working. So that uses carbohydrate while you are sleeping. And in the morning, you want to make sure that you make up for that. So having a good pre-race high carbohydrate meal is going to help with that small tank that we have in the liver.
yeah, 100%. And everything you said makes sense. I am also wondering, so you mentioned jam, and I think a lot of people and listeners might be having like peanut butter toast with banana, but can you talk about the difference maybe in the content for a peanut butter versus jam and why you reckon jam might be better? But it might depend. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, it absolutely depends. So peanut butter is something that will predominantly offer fat. When we're eating before the race, it depends on one, the tolerance of the person and how far advanced from the race we're eating it. So if you were to tell me that you have 1 hour between eating your toast and doing the race, I will absolutely discourage you from having it with peanut butter, especially if you are planning to be very generous with it. Because what it does is that you are eating fat. Fat will take longer to be digested, and it could mean, especially in your case that you are running at high intensity, that you will have issues as you are starting your race. If you're saying 2 hours or earlier, which I think for most races is the case, most of us like to wake up with plenty of time. So we go a million times to the toilet and do all the things that we need. And in that case, having peanut butter, it could even be helpful because the benefit of, just as it slows down digestion, adding peanut butter to that carbohydrate also slows down the absorption. So if you're eating 2 hours before the race, we want that carbohydrate to be available when we are racing. So it means that by delaying that absorption a little bit, it means that it doesn't go straight into your blood glucose, let's say, straight away. It's something that stays being digested a little bit longer, and that can be helpful. So my recommendation is whatever you decide to do, try it during training. So we want that breakfast to be enjoyable. Of course, most people would say like, hey, it doesn't matter. I'll just as long as it ticks the boxes, that's fine. But if it's if adding peanut butter is going to make it easier for you to eat it, I will absolutely recommend it. Just make sure that you do that during training. So that way you're very confident by the time you show up on race day, knowing that that breakfast works extremely well for you and you're always very comfortable with what you're eating.
Yeah, for sure. Makes total sense. Thank you. Yeah, to close off the carb loading part of the podcast, do you know how much benefit it actually has in terms of performance? Is it different for each individual? I guess it does depend on how well they carb load too. So the evidence might be quite varied.
It varies a little bit. It, of course, can't be as everything. We can say like, oh, because it worked for this person, this way is going to be exactly the same for everybody else. But consistently, research has shown that yes, it helps when it comes to time trial performance. So something that is in a set distance and see who finishes quicker. A 2 to 3% improvement for those who completed a carb loading protocol. When it comes to studies with time to exhaustion, so essentially who can last longer doing a specific effort at certain intensity, well, a 20% delayed in fatigue for people who complete a carb loading protocol. And when it comes to female versus male, something that was another misconception around carb loading was the idea that female athletes wouldn't benefit from it. However, the issues that were around those studies was that they were telling female athletes to consume carbohydrates as percentage of their diet, which meant that if they were already eating not enough calories and then they just have to increase the percentage of carbohydrate, it was not enough carbohydrate to actually carb load. So now we know that when you actually carb load following the 8 to 12 grams per kilo, the carbohydrate loading is going to be helpful for both male and female athletes. In the case of female athletes, potentially staying on the lower end is going to be more helpful and, of course, comfortable. And but at the end, it does help for sure. And something else I do want to say before we close the carb loading topic is something that I think is really important, because we already established that, yes, it is helpful. We established that you need a lot of carbs and we want to make sure that you don't have issues. So as much as carbohydrate loading is helpful, it's really important that you make sure you are comfortable. So that means that even doing a practice, if for example, this marathon is something that you've been training for the whole year and is your A race and you really don't want to have anything wrong going with it, I would suggest, okay, what if we do a carb loading test where for one day, weeks before the race, you test it and you make sure you're comfortable, your system was happy with it, you didn't have any issues with the foods that you were consuming. And that way, when you do your carb loading 2 days before your big race, you know that everything is going to go well because your system will welcome the food as well.
Yeah. And in regards to I think you said women might want to start off with the lower end of the range in terms of 8 to 12 grams an hour. Is there like an anatomical difference, like smaller stomach or something? Is that why? Or
so more about, well, not a stomach, more about the storage of glycogen, potentially smaller. And that it's because muscle glycogen is where it's a store. So women or female athletes tend to have smaller muscles compared to men. So that's why there's actually some reference also talking about going by kilos of lean mass. So that probably will make it more accurate. So that way, regardless of your body weight, if you are accounting for your lean mass, that could be the way to go. However, because it's not as easy for everybody to be aware of exactly how much lean mass they have, going by total body weight is easier.
Yeah, for sure. Like I have no idea what my body composition is, but yeah, I think going by weight is more accessible to the regular population that haven't done a body composition test. Cool. And yeah, carb loading, it's probably it is very important. We know that, but also the fueling that you do during the marathon is also very important as well. So give us a bit of an outline. I know some people talk about like 60 to 90 grams an hour, but there's a lot of different numbers out there. I'm assuming that as long as your stomach can handle it, more is better, but I might be wrong. Tell me everything.
Yes. So because we already talked about how pushing at higher intensity demands more carbohydrate, we are seeing a shift in elite athletes towards increasing their carbohydrate intake per hour. So the recommendations go from 60 to 90. I actually suggest people to go between 30 to 90 because most people, even 60 grams an hour is a lot. It's essentially one energy gel every half an hour. And for some people, that's quite intimidating. It depends on the energy gel, probably more like every 20 minutes. So it's a lot. So that's why I said like, okay, let's start with 30. And from there we can build up. And the science behind it is that the gut is capable of absorbing 1 gram of glucose per minute. So 60 minutes in 1 hour, 60 grams per hour. However, the gut is also capable of absorbing 0.5 grams of fructose per minute. So 30 grams per hour. If we put them together, 90 grams in total. So that's why we're seeing, because in the past, the recommendation was 60 grams an hour. Now, that's why when they are saying multiple transportable carbohydrates in the formulas for products like Morten, actually most sports brands are shifting towards that multiple carbs, which is usually glucose, fructose, or something that like a carbohydrate that will be absorbed in a similar way, like maltodextrin. So that's why we're seeing people going more towards the 90 grams an hour, because of course, that extra carbohydrate is going to be helpful. However, that is where it's really important to acknowledge the component of how quickly you are using it. So someone pushing at higher intensity, for that person, being able to consume carbohydrates at the top end of the range is going to be helpful. But it means that they have to train their gut to be comfortable with that. Because imagine 60 grams an hour is, let's say, one energy gel every 25 minutes. If we want to go for 90, that's pretty much, well, for example, Precision has those fuel packs, there's like one of those per hour, which is very intimidating and quite a lot. So you need to be comfortable. If you're someone who is not pushing at such high intensity, then the recommendation is to stay on the lower end. Carbohydrates are still going to be helpful, but having the carbohydrate is not magically going to make you push harder if that's not something you are used to. So it's better to stay comfortable instead of consuming something that you are not using at such high rate and upsetting your stomach. In the case of athletes, pushing now above 90 grams an hour. So for example, I know, at least I've seen some tweets going around saying that Kipchoge is consuming 100 grams an hour or a little bit more. Well, we're seeing that. However, so far the research hasn't caught up, and there's still a little bit of mixed evidence on whether that is beneficial or not, of whether having that extra carbohydrate is helping the athlete, or is it something that is essentially going to waste because it's not being oxidized, which is being utilized as efficiently. So, I mean, this is my theory, but I'm of the idea that because elite athletes pretty much have the ability and capacities of superhumans for like some things, like, for example, being able to sustain efforts for higher intensity for longer, I do think that potentially in their case, the ability to oxidize carbohydrate is also higher. So it means that, yes, they are benefiting from having that higher carbohydrate consumption. But this is my theory. It doesn't say, it's been proven, but I do see that, because we see that they are capable of things way above the average, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case for them in the case of being able to utilize carbohydrate way more efficiently than most people.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me as well. I feel like the elites would, probably benefit from the slightly bit extra. There's a few questions I want to ask now. Like, we've unpacked a lot of stuff there. So is the glucose and fructose thing that you just talked about, is that why people talk about like this 2-to-1 ratio and stuff, which I never really understood before today? Okay, yeah.
Yes, that's pretty much it. So what they are saying is that because you want that, right? So because and this is an average again. So on average, you can, for every gram of glucose, you are able to process 0.5 of fructose. So you want to sustain that ratio. If you start consuming most of your carbohydrate from fructose, you are going to have issues because it's not as absorbed as efficiently. So you want to maintain that. And by also it is not until you have saturated the glucose component that fructose is absorbed more efficiently. So that's why most products will recommend that ratio. And of course, most products will say, stick to this one so that way you don't screw up the ratio. I believe that first, once you start understanding how your strategy or your nutrition for that event is composed and what you're using, it is possible to mix different things between sports drinks, gels, and even food, depending on how high we're aiming for the carbohydrate consumption, and still be comfortable.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, I'm sure because of that ratio as well, like a lot of nutritionists might go with different approaches where they would recommend the athlete to start with a glucose only gel, but then maybe introduce the glucose and fructose gel from like half an hour in or something. I don't know what people do, but I can see that it offers a bigger range of like ways to achieve that 2-to-1 ratio and all that. Because you said that glucose needs to be used before fructose, right? Or
Sort of
how
at the
did you
same
explain it?
time, let's
Yeah.
say. Yeah,
Okay.
like at the same time. So it's difficult because, and that's why I try not to overcomplicate it for my clients. Because
Yeah.
then imagine I was like, oh, was I supposed to have this one first or this other one?
Sure.
But as long as people are actually, let's say, using them simultaneously, it should be all right.
Okay.
The problem
Yeah.
is when someone, especially when we go towards the real food crowd, that's when the fructose component can be quite high because usually people tend to go for fruits and foods that are going to be high in fructose. And that could be problematic because that now the ratio is not as it should.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, maybe let's start using me more as an example. So moving a little bit onwards from the marathon, I've done like an 80-kilometer race, quite a fast pace for the course and all that, recently. And I think I haven't really calculated it properly, but based off of like how many gels an hour I had, and I also had one of those, precision 90 gels at one point, and I also had a gel flask where I could put 3 gels in it, so I knew what was in that gel flask. But I calculated it to be roughly somewhere between 95 to like 105 grams an hour, which I'm pretty surprised with. But at the same time, I'm quite known to have an iron stomach. Like I've eaten Indian curry and then like run 30-kilometer long runs quite fast and been completely fine. So my stomach's usually quite good. So some people are like, oh, I'm not surprised you did that. But from like a numbers perspective, because I know that elite people are doing that sort of thing, I was surprised that I managed to do that without any stomach issues. Do you reckon it helps to mix it up with the drink mixes and the gels and like clip blocks, like the solids and stuff? I guess in a trail perspective, because I did it in the trail, not road.
So first, I think there's a lot of people listening right now who are very jealous of you
Yeah.
being able to have a curry and just go and run without
Yeah.
issues. But yeah, it depends a lot on your preference. So for example, you already have this experience, 80 kilometers, 100 grams an hour with only energy gels. And
Oh,
you didn't
and drink
experience
mix.
and drink mix.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So one of the concerns and one of the reasons I would suggest someone to have a mix of things and let's say textures is just to try and avoid that flavor fatigue. But
Palate
in
fatigue.
someone, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But someone in your situation where you are going for such high intake, probably with the flavor fatigue is the last of our concerns because we know that you are going to need sweet things because most of the high carbohydrate options and that are going to be absorbed quickly will be pretty much sugar. So that's what those sports drinks are, the energy gels are. So I wouldn't be too concerned about like, oh, let's make sure you have a sandwich or something like that because if I do that, I probably will cause issues for you because that is something that will be absorbed a little bit more slowly, and that can mess up with your ability to process that carbohydrate quickly. If we add something like the Cliff Locks or gummies or something like that, it depends on how comfortable you are with chewing while you're running. And if that's something that, for example, disrupts your breathing and your rhythm, I would say let's just not use that. If you are already comfortable for these distances with sports drink and energy gels, I would say let's stay there. For someone more on the lower end, let's say below 90, that's when we can introduce other things, mostly to avoid that flavor fatigue. And especially, well, flavor fatigue. And another issue I see is that people lose interest in food. And many people could say like, oh, just push through and try to eat and it's fine. But often that losing interest in food is associated, well, is coming with nausea and some other very nasty symptoms that make it impossible to actually eat. So if that is something that's occurring, then we explore, okay, let's see if maybe using different foods or products could be helpful in a situation like this. But yeah, if you're already there, unless you start exploring, let's say, longer distances, that's when I will be like, okay, let's see how you go with that, because maybe sustaining the intensity likely as much as you are pushing hard, will go lower if we want to sustain, let's say, 100 miler. And in that case, having such high consumption of like sugar could be a lot in terms of you being comfortable, and maybe adding some breaks with some food in between can be helpful.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I did forget to say, I did have potato chips, like crisps, that was salty because I was aware of palate fatigue because I have done backyard ultra before, and I know that you get bored of like only sweet stuff, or even texture. You get quite bored of the same texture all the time. So I had like a Ziploc bag with a little bit of chips in it to have a bit of salty stuff occasionally. But yeah, I guess apart from that, I predominantly did it on gels and drink mix. But the other thing I want to talk about as well, which some people here might find interesting, even for the marathon, is obviously there's aid stations in a marathon, like a road marathon, where you have those cups with electrolytes in it and water in it. And people might be wondering, like, am I meant to take water every time or alternate between electrolytes and water? What's your thoughts on that?
So it comes down to what is the plan you have for that event. So actually, we can use you as an example. So would you normally go into the marathon saying, all right, I'm going to have these many energy gels, or what is your strategy when you are heading into the marathon?
Honestly, I don't have too much experience doing like road marathons or like road 50Ks, but if I were to do it with my current knowledge, I know that when I'm running really quick on the road, I don't think I can have 100 grams an hour. I think that's too much when I'm running that quick, as opposed to trail running where you're going a bit slower. It's a bit easier to consume. So I would probably only go for like 60 grams an hour, so like 2 gels an hour. And I might even try and not have any water or electrolytes, assuming I'm running roughly 2 hours, 30 minutes in the marathon. So I want to know what your thoughts are on that strategy of no water, no electrolytes, but just 2 gels an hour for a marathon.
Yeah, interesting. So there are two things that we're getting from, for example, the electrolytes. Depends on the brand. Some recently, some races have electrolytes that are literally just electrolytes. So it means that is a combination of salts like sodium, potassium, and the electrolytes. Most races will have something like Gatorade, Power, or some sort of a sports drink that, of course, has electrolytes, but also has carbohydrate. So when it comes to whether like you should choose the electrolytes or the plain water, the reason I ask about what's the strategy is because if you're already, let's say you've been training and you're aware that 60 grams an hour is what you would like to get, and let's say you are falling short with the 2 energy gels per hour, well, it's convenient to be like, okay, let's try and count a sip of electrolytes from every aid station to make up for those additional 10 grams I need per hour. So I would encourage that. So like, okay, let's try and get those electrolytes because that's going to give you additional carbohydrate. Some people are hesitant to do that because if that's not a product they've been using, they don't want to risk it. I 100% appreciate that. For some people, they have very sensitive guts, and whatever it is there, if they haven't tried it, they would rather not try it, don't use it. For some others, is yeah, that's fine. I can easily have whatever. Like, for example, probably in your case, you probably will be all right if you're like, yeah, it's all right, I'll just have this. So that's when I will encourage the electrolyte. If with what you have with you, energy gels, or let's say it's a race that actually allows you to have a mix, a carb mix with you, then we could just go with that. However, I do encourage the water consumption based on your thirst. And it does depend on, I mean, you said 2.5 hours. So it depends. If you're someone who has a really high sweat rate, you could end severely dehydrated if you don't consume any water then. And the problem with dehydration, one is, of course, a health risk. But if we look at the performance, it also is impacted. And also, when it comes to consuming your energy gels, being dehydrated is going to make it difficult for your system to absorb them. So it is possible that you also end up with gut issues because your system was missing on fluids. So that's why I would say, let's try and make sure you are drinking some water throughout. Now, I'm assuming the reason to not drink water is because you don't want to disrupt your pace, right? You just want to keep going and not being interrupted by trying to drink it. So in that case, my suggestion would be like, let's practice that. Let's get you extremely comfortable drinking water and sustaining a really high intensity effort. It is possible. The problem most people find, even myself, because literally this is what happened. I ran a marathon last year. And because in triathlons, I actually can drink water relatively well, I assumed that in my marathon, I was going to be able to stay hydrated from the 8 stations. So from the start, and I should have noticed this from the start, I was trying to grab the cup and drink, but because I didn't practice any of that. It was impossible to drink, to be running and drinking. I just couldn't. So it meant that by halfway through the marathon, I was definitely dehydrated. And what I had to do then, because I was dehydrated and now my system was rejecting the energy gels, it was difficult to have them. I started to have the electrolytes. So in this case, it was Gatorade. So every aid station, I was making sure I was drinking this. And to make sure I was drinking it, it was, okay, let's walk the aid station because there's no option. So it's quite frustrating, right? If I had practiced the hydration and if I had been clever enough at the time in terms of, okay, this strategy of me trying to drink water is not working this way. I have to do something about it. Probably I wouldn't have ended up in the situation I was. So it is likely that if I had practiced that, the drinking the water, or acknowledge that is like, you know what, I don't have a way of training this water drinking. So I'll just have to plan my pace in a way that, okay, I actually have to walk a few steps so I can drink this and keep going and make it part of my, let's say, rhythm. I probably would have had a way better experience than the very hard lesson I learned. I mean, the marathon still went really well. I still got like half an hour PB, but yeah, it could have been even better if I had consider that part as well.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like when you're running a marathon, it's inevitably going to be 2 hours anywhere up to like the cutoff time, 8 hours, 9 hours, or whatever. And yeah, when you think about a few steps walking to consume water, it probably is actually worth it. So I think it's better to think of it that way. You're just kind of saving yourself for later, and not having a tougher time later on. And it's funny you mentioned about the practicing the water part in training, because I think it's the exact same with practicing gels in training. I feel like the act of opening a packet while you're running and consuming it while you're running is also a skill in itself. So that's another reason on top of the like training your stomach to be able to handle it, another incentive to actually use gels in practice. And if you're doing like a long run workout where you have like, threshold efforts or marathon pace efforts in the second half of the run, I try and encourage all my athletes to take it during the rep rather than the recovery in between, because I want them to be used to opening it and handling it and consuming it, because on race day, that's what you're going to be doing anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, literally. Well done. Because that's exactly what I advise all my clients. When you have efforts like that, they are perfect, but make sure you are eating the energy gel during the effort. Because of course, in efforts like that, when you have a period where you're going at lower intensity for the rest, it is convenient, right? Like, well, I can have the energy gel now. However, on race day, you're going to be super grateful you actually practice it at the pace that you are supposed to be running. So that way you stay comfortable and it's not disrupting your pace, because you're confident in consuming that without issues.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I know we're going back to marathon stuff now, but talk a bit about how you can progressively overload your gels per hour or carbs per hour in like weekly training. Because assuming that everyone does one long run every weekend, like how would you go about trying to increasing it a little bit?
Yeah, so it very much depends on, first, what is the training program and where we're at in the training phase. So for example, let's say it's someone who is 12 weeks out from the marathon or for whatever race they have, I probably wouldn't be encouraging someone to be there, start to be consuming some energy gels, because then what we're looking at is your nutrition balance? Are you eating well? Other things. Of course, this person is already exercising and is already training. So what we look at is more about the timing of nutrition. So it's more about, okay, how can we make sure that first, before and after your training, you're fueling adequately? And depending on how long and intense your training sessions are, decide if we need to incorporate nutrition during those sessions. So what I often talk about is anything that is high intensity or long duration or high and long will need fuel, preferably, let's say anything that is 90 minutes or less, 100% beforehand, you need to consume something. 90 minutes or longer, that's when we start making sure that there is carbohydrate consumption during the effort and of course beforehand. So let's move on closer to race day. So we talk about like, okay, how do we progress the quantities? So let's say it's someone who has zero experience consuming carbohydrate during the activity. Ideally, this is someone who started working with me 12 weeks at least. So that way we have trying to incorporate even the nutrition before the training, which in many cases people just don't do. So it means that in the case of this person, we're looking at, all right, let's try and aim for 30 grams of carbohydrate an hour. So it means that one energy gel every 50 minutes. I'm thinking most energy gels being like 25 grams. So it's like, okay, maybe every 50 minutes, and we're sort of around the 30 gram per hour if we do that. Once we get there, is exploring first how comfortable did that feel. No, it was good. I think I can increase the frequency. Or actually, I got sick of the energy gels. Can I have, yes, more carbohydrate, but it would be possible to have it from a carb mix. Or I actually tried the Cliff Logs or the chews, and those work really well. So can I explore using that as well? Perfect. So let's try and build. And I would probably do it 10 grams at a time. So it means that we go from 30 to 40 till we get to the point that person is very comfortable. If this is someone who has experience in consuming carbohydrate, we look first at, okay, how much? So let's say it's someone who is doing 50 grams. Is all right, well, 50 is very decent. That's great. Would you be open to try a little bit more and see how you feel? Yeah, sounds great. So we start again, 10 grams at a time. So it pretty much depends on the experience of the person. And it is possible depending on the race format. So if it's a marathon, I would say you pretty much, there are only three options for the carbohydrate for most people. It's either the gummies, the energy gels, or the sports drink. If we're talking about ultras, well, the options can be endless in terms of adding options there, because of course people have access to a pack and crew and aid stations and other things that make it easier to incorporate things. And also I will encourage it because we have flavor fatigue, and there are other factors to consider which is why I recommend other foods in those cases.
Yeah, I think going on to the ultra stuff, as like if you're running for 24 hours, 48 hours, the 3 meals a day kind of thing has to sort of come back. Obviously, we might not be having exactly 3 meals a day, but you need that element of starting to think about protein and other stuff as well, I'm assuming. I've never done a race that long, so I'm not actually too familiar with it, but I can imagine that would be the case, right? Like
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So protein definitely starts becoming important, not to the point of being more important than carbohydrate. But yeah, if we're going for something so long, we need to think beyond the energy component of the nutrition and start thinking of the nutrient component of the nutrition. Because when we look at objectives for a race nutrition plan, yes, the first one is to keep that energy high, consistent energy, consistent effort. However, the second thing we also want is to keep the body working properly. Because the thing is, and everybody forgets this, is that even though you're in a race and you are running, your body is trying to keep everything else working. So every other system in your body is still working and is still needing nutrients. So the longer you're going, the more important those nutrients are going to become. And one of them is going to be protein. So that's when it's helpful. And when it's helpful to incorporate more, let's say, meals or options that are a little bit more balanced. So that way that protein component can be incorporated into the nutrition.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, this is awesome. I'm learning so much from this podcast episode. It's amazing.
Excellent.
That does cover most of it, though. I think I'm going to put myself in the shoes of someone that's a little bit newer in the marathon, and they might be wondering, like, is it really important for me as a new marathoner, not running like overly quick? I might even walk past it as well. Is carb intake during the run still important? They might be wondering that. How would you answer that?
Yes, it still matters, but I would keep it very simple. Let's say this is your first marathon. There's no point in overwhelming you as the new marathon runner with, okay, you need to have this many grams per hour, and don't forget the electrolytes, and remember you need to do the carb loading. Hang on, this person is having their first experience and they already spent months with like being overwhelmed with training and looking at shoes and things like that adding more overwhelm is not helpful. However, the nutrition is helpful. Now, in the case of someone like that, we will keep things simple. It's like, okay, you know what? First, ideally, we want that's something that we're discussing at least, I would say, minimum 1 month before the marathon. So there's an opportunity to test some of these things. I would never, if someone is literally 2 days or the week of the marathon saying like, Gaby, what should I do? I will be like, literally do whatever you've been doing, because I wouldn't suggest any change. But if at least we're a month beforehand, we'll be like, okay, let's explore the option of maybe you having one energy gel every 45 minutes, which is reasonable consumption, and see how comfortable you feel with that. And let's make sure that when you have it, ideally you want to have it near an aid station. So that way you sip some water while you're doing that, because for most people it makes it way more comfortable to consume the energy gel. In that case, something that is key, especially for people who are let's say more towards the back of the pack, is that they don't overdo hydration. It doesn't mean that people at the front can't do that, but usually when we're going slower and people start being concerned about like, oh, I need to be hydrated, they start drinking water without even being thirsty, and that can lead to overhydration, which is quite serious. So it's making a big emphasis in like, hey, hydration is important, but trust your thirst. If you're thirsty, drink. If the aid station is there, but you don't feel like drinking, it's fine. Move on to the next one. Most marathons will be every 5K. So let's say someone who's taking a long time, maybe it's helpful. Okay, you know what? Take the cup with you, because let's say it will take you a whole hour to get to the next 5. And just sip through it, but don't try to be like drinking several cups while you are there, because that probably will be too much. So those are the things I would like suggest to try and keep it simple. And in the lead up, I don't think I would suggest a carb loading per se. What I often talk about is a more like carb focused menu. Whereas, yes, let's be intentional about adding some carbohydrate or increasing the portion of your carbohydrate consumption, but just slightly, let's say by 30%. So if you normally have 2 slices of bread, let's have a third one. If you normally have a fruit with your morning tea, let's have a fruit with a muesli bar. So just let's increase the carbohydrate consumption and keep it simple.
Yeah, I love how your approach is really individual to the person, their background, and yeah, not overwhelming the people, because you're so right. When you're first starting stuff, it's like information overload and it can get pretty hectic. But I'm at the stage where, I know a lot of people in different professions, like you, nutritionists, physiotherapists, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm at the stage where I'm slowly learning one by one. And yeah, it's important as well as a beginner runner to like slowly learn as well and not have everything dumped on them at once. So yeah, I think that's a very good approach. And I will, recommend a lot of the listeners to hit up Gaby, if you have any questions, because she'll, be able to give you a personalized plan as well. But I have one last question before we wrap up, and that was regarding the saying where people say you got to practice nutrition because your stomach has to get used to it. And what exactly is that referring to? Like, does it mean that if you don't practice in your training, your body is not going to be good at absorbing the glucose and it just gets unused? Or how does that work? Yeah.
So it's mostly, it's called gut training. Because the thing is that, our gut, because everybody eats daily, yes, is capable of processing food. But what our body struggles with is when you are moving at the same time, because that is an activity that is demanding a lot of resources towards your extremities, especially your legs. And those resources include your blood. So it means that your blood is directed to your limbs, and then you are trying to consume, let's say someone listening and says, oh, amazing, I have my marathon in 2 weeks. Let's go for the 90 grams because that's amazing. I'm going to do it. And they never tried anything like that during training. It is unlikely the gut is going to be comfortable consuming at such rate because there was no training undergone. So it's literally the same as if you were to say, oh, I'm only doing 5Ks per day, and suddenly I think that I'm going to be capable of running a marathon in 2 weeks. Well, very difficult if you haven't been doing the training, or someone who literally had 0 training and then thinking they can just do it. They may, but it's going to be very painful. So it's the same with the gut. And when we say we need to practice your nutrition, what many people assume is that, well, I literally tried one single energy gel and I didn't have issues. Yeah, it tastes all right. It's very sweet. I finished my run without problems. And then they expect that having 3 per hour is going to be literally the same thing. And of course not. So when I say practice your nutrition is at minimum, literally what we were talking about, for example, in those race-based efforts, even just on your long run, even if there's no race-based effort there, trying to do literally what you're planning to do on race day. So if your intention is doing 1, 2, 3, however energy gels per hour, let's do that while you are training. And I would say at minimum, you want to do 2 training sessions where you have done that, but I would say even more. So usually the athletes I work with, I mentioned the 12 weeks. From the 12 weeks, we're already, depending on the training sessions they have, we're already incorporating nutrition during training, especially in those longer sessions. Because on top of training your gut, what you're doing is giving your body the energy so you can train well. So it's a massive benefit doing that. And it means that someone who is deliberate about that fuel consumption, by the time you approach race day, you're confident that your body is going to take it well because you've been doing it consistently during training.
Yeah. You know what I did forget actually, and the listeners that are still here late into the podcast will benefit from this, but I didn't even talk about caffeine. I think that's still worth talking about as well. So yeah, assuming that I don't know anything about caffeine, apart from I know that it decreases your perceived exertion, so it feels easier when you consume it. I'd love to know whether it's better to have it early on in the race, later on, bit of both, mix it up. I'm not sure. Let me know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so caffeine, 100% love it, is among the ergogenic aids or supplements, let's say, that actually works. There's so many out there, but caffeine is one of the ones that, especially in the case of endurance, is extremely helpful. Now, the way it works, literally what you said, yes, it reduces the perceived effort. So cognitively, someone may feel like it's easier and that therefore you can push harder for longer. So you are more comfortable, which is helpful. The other thing is that it also helps utilizing fat a little bit more efficiently, which is helpful because, as we said, even someone pushing high intensity is still using fat as fuel to a certain degree. So having that caffeine is going to help in that fat utilization. Is not massive, but at least it's an extra aid. And the other thing, especially when we talk about ultras, is that cognitive alertness. And I mean, a lot of the runners I work with are first doing backyard ultras or 24-hour plus formats. And in that case, we need all the help we can get when you are so sleep deprived, and caffeine is going to be helpful. If we stick to the marathon, in the past, it was believed that having the caffeine before the race, usually 1 hour, was going to be enough. So you essentially, what caffeine does is that you have the caffeine and at 1 hour, it usually peaks and it has a half-life of 4 hours, which means that the effect, let's say, lasts on average 4 hours. So in the case of a marathon, for most people, let's say that is going to be enough, or technically based on that idea. However, research is showing that for people who take it at later stages of the race, it's also beneficial because it helps with that, especially since you are starting to decline because now you're more fatigued with that perceived effort. So it's helpful to have the caffeine towards the second half of the race. Now, what research is not unclear is whether it's better to delay the intake of caffeine or if it's okay to include a second intake of caffeine. So let's say you have it before the marathon. For most people, I actually say, have your coffee before the race. Like literally, that's a good way of getting your caffeine. And then during the marathon, you have a caffeine energy gel or some caffeinated option, like for example, those Rebbies that are the strips. That can be an option. And we have that in the, I'd say halfway because of that hour peak. So you don't want to like literally have the caffeine gel cross the finish line and that's when it's peaking. And I see that still helps, but a lot of people try to actually delay it as much as possible till they actually need it. And for me, that's too late. If you start feeling like, oh, the caffeine gel will be nice here, it's probably too late because now you're already starting to feel fatigue. So we want to catch it early. So ideally, we want to schedule that and think of like, okay, I know that for the last hour, or let's say at least the last 45 minutes of my marathon, I want to have that peak. But let's make sure that we have that consumption at a stage where that peak is there.
Yeah, definitely agree that you need to take it before the fatigue sets in. Because again, it takes a bit of time to actually kick in and have the positive effect. And it's funny because I was thinking of wrapping up the podcast, but then I keep thinking of more stuff. But now, because you mentioned a bit about fat again, I remembered that I've read up on stuff sometimes about fat adaptation, as in using fat as a fuel source and getting used to it. I think historically, I always eat before a run because I have that iron stomach where I'm able to eat and then like literally 5 minutes later, I can go out for a run. So I've never really done runs where I'm like food deprived. And what are your thoughts on fat adaptation training? Is it something that everyone should be doing? Because I always want to become a better runner. So if it means I'll be a better runner by doing it a little bit, I want to. So what are the details?
Well, I have good news for you. First, well done that you're eating before you run because that is helpful. When it comes to fat adaptation, what we're seeing is that you don't need to push in terms of like going into fasted training and trying to be totally energy depleted for your body to benefit from fat adaptation. Because as we've been saying, the training itself is what is helping your body become efficient at using it. So you doing your long runs, it's actually helping your body be fat adapted. Especially, for example, in the case of, let's say, that zone 2 training where a lot of the energy that you're going to be using is fat, is going to be enough for your body to have that fat adaptation. Now, because we know that at lower intensities, fat is more helpful, someone especially in the ultra space, will be thinking, well, it's very helpful for my body to be very efficient with fat so that way I don't need as much carbohydrate. Potentially, but it doesn't mean that you won't need to eat. And that is, I see a lot of people think that being fat adapted means that they won't need nutrition, and they just think that maybe something here and there is going to be enough. And there are two big issues with that. One is that your body definitely still needs carbohydrate. So even if you're fat adapted, and I know people who say like, oh, I can run 4 hours fasted. Yes, but if I ask you to sustain the effort at higher intensity, if it's a race, I can 100% guarantee that if I could clone you and give you food, you will outpace yourself easily. Like that person would run way faster. So that's one. The second one is that, as we already talked about the blood flow being directed to your legs, eating is actually preventing gut issues, because what eating is doing is telling your blood that there needs to be activation in the stomach. When your gut does not have blood, or is restricted in terms of blood flow, it's not like it doesn't have any, but is quite restricted because everything is directed to your limbs. There could be even tissue damage, which can cause severe health issues. And gut issues, of course. So it means that eating is actually helpful for avoiding gut issues. So definitely fat adaptation. So in summary, fat adaptation is something that you are already naturally doing by training. Yes, using fat as fuel is helpful. However, not eating is not going to avoid gut issues.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's really important to re-emphasize that point about how blood will flow naturally, as in there'll be more blood flow to the areas that are working and then less to the parts that aren't working. So yeah, I guess that does emphasize that it is important to fuel on the run as well when we're doing long stuff. So thank you for that. And it makes me feel a bit better that I haven't tried that sort of thing too much, because yeah, I've never tried it, and I think I'll carry on not trying after that answer. But yeah, that should be it. Again, I learned so much from this. This is so good, and I'm glad I got someone that's really into endurance, because it makes a huge difference when they know what the sport is about as well. Because you need to be quite niche with service nowadays, because that's what separates you from everyone else. So yeah, again, thank you so much, and tell us more about your business to finish off.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So yes, you can find me as @IntensityFit on Instagram. I'm sure you're going to tag on the show notes. And also I have a free quiz that people can take absolutely for free. You answer 20 questions, and what that quiz does is give you an endurance nutrition audit. So at the end, it gives you feedback in terms of how you're fueling day-to-day training nutrition, race nutrition, and your overall, let's say, mindset around fueling. And it gives you feedback on each of those areas, so you can start looking at what are some things that will be helpful for you to start addressing. And that is also on my website, and I'm happy to share the link with you so that you can add it there for people to check it out.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for everything today.
Yeah, happy to chat. Thank you.